I'm going to get started and hopefully a few more people join in. That'd be great. So, did this last Monday, kind of revisited the slides, made some adjustments, and came back. And one of the big reasons why I'm doing this is normally at this time of year, I'm coaching at the Rad Room in locals CompuTrainer studio. So usually Tuesdays and Thursday nights, I'd be inside yelling at people on their trainers to go harder, go easier, that kind of stuff. And obviously this year I am kind of missing out on that. So I wanted to kind of fill in that blank with something. So this is the something. I do plan to continue doing these, and so I welcome topics. If there's a topic that you want me to delve into, then shoot me a message and I'll do my best to bring that up if it doesn't get interwoven into one of these. So, and I have a few on kind of the books already that I'd like to work through, going into like a little bit more into physiology and what different trainings are targeting with physiology, using Moxy, muscle oxygen saturation. I could do I could talk for 3 hours on erg mode with a trainer. Um, and so, but if you have any ideas, feel free, get those to me. Awesome. I see a few more people joining in. So once again, thank you for joining tonight. Hope everyone's safe and healthy, and we're gonna get rolling here. So please ask questions as they come up. And the one thing I have to say is there's about a 2 minute delay from when I'm talking to when you see it and when I'll see your question. So if it seems like I blow past your question, just be patient and you will see that. I'll answer it or I'll try to wind it into something else. So please ask questions. And so obviously I'm just doing this as a straight webinar. You can't see me, so there's a picture of me. My name's Andrew Watson. I've been coaching for about 10 years now, and before that I was a full-time athlete and raced professionally I ended my professional career with the Norco Factory team, and the last few years of racing I slowly transitioned into more and more coaching before I finally retired in 2015. Um, and but a lot of what my founding principles and philosophies were really ingrained in me with the coaches that I've worked with over the years, and so I've been training with power since for about 20 years now. And it's funny, power hasn't really come a long way. I can't say that it has, but the data analytics has, and that's what's really cool about the new stuff coming out now and what we can do with that data. So I'm an NCCP competition development coach, so that's the new level 3. PMBIA, so that's Professional Mountain Bike Instructors Association. I'm a level 2 AIR certified instructor. Um, Half of what I do is training athletes and coaching athletes, and the other half is just working on skills, and that's what I love to do. Those two main things. I'm also Training Peaks Power certified. I went through a bit of a process there to be certified, and I'm a Training Peaks Level 2 coach as well. So, and there's my contact, Andrew at awicoaching.com. Feel free to reach out, and website awicoaching.com. Pretty simple. Okay, so let's get into it. What is the power meter telling us? I put a measuring stick there because it's really all it is. It's just a way to get good, consistent data. It is instantaneous, and that's great. When you push hard on the pedals, the power goes up. If we're just thinking about using heart rate's always delayed. So that's one of the great things about using power. Where that comes from on a bike is how hard we push on a pedal and how fast we pedal. And that could be its own webinar. But generally speaking, if you want to push 200 watts at 50 RPM, you're going to have to put down more force than if you want to do 100 RPM and 200 watts. So always kind of think of that, keep that in mind as well. It's consistent. As long as it's the same power meter, it's calibrated, not really out of whack, every day is going to be the same. So it's not influenced, such as heart rate, which can be influenced by stress, nutrition, sleep, all those different things. And power is also not influenced by the weather, wind, any of those external factors. And what I really like to use Power for is, and why it's great even for a beginner cyclist, if it's in the budget to have a power meter, or if they can buy a power meter on a bike, secondhand, or you pay a couple extra bucks, it's great. And one of the best things to do with it is to think about it becoming the calibration tool for you and to hone your rate of perceived exertion. It's really easy to maybe go too hard on workouts, and you feel good early, but with the power meter, it just kind of keeps you honest. So that's one of the great things about it. And the end goal, I was talking to another coach about this a while ago, was the end goal of power and getting a power meter is that, after several years, months of using it, you can really, you know, go back to riding just by feel once you've calibrated yourself to it. And then you're just using the power data afterwards to analyze the workouts and analyze the trends and tweak from there. So getting a power meter, I think some people have this notion that you become a slave to it. And that's not what it's about. It's just about informing you and calibrating your own riding. And so the first step to getting a power meter and to start training with the power meter is to set those training zones and benchmarks. And I switched this around from the last webinar that I did. So we so I'm going to do training zones first. And most training zones are set off of FTP, and FTP is functional threshold power, which is the maximum power you can sustain in a quasi steady state for 30 to 70 minutes. It's not just 60 minutes. That was an oversimplified way of looking at it several years ago. We know that it can be shorter or a little bit longer than 60 minutes. And two common protocols for determining that is a ramp test and a 20-minute time trial. So ramp tests are great if you have a smart trainer. This is probably going to be your first introduction to testing. And basically, there's several different variations of this, but it's a fixed wattage increasing over a fixed amount of time. So it can be 30 watts every 3 minutes, it can be 10 watts every 1 minute, and et cetera, et cetera. And and then you go until you can't go anymore. You completely fail and you can't pedal and the RPM drops, you basically take 75% of the last 60 seconds, and that's around your threshold. And it can be off by quite a bit. So that's why I kind of say this is a good little intro to testing. It's repeatable. You don't really have to pace it. You literally just pedal, and the smart trainer will hold you in erg mode. It doesn't take very long to do this test. But there are some cons. It doesn't really take a lot of athlete focus to do it, where I like athletes to work on their focus. So you'll move on to a 20-minute all-out effort. And if you do this right, if you do a hard warm-up before to burn off some of your lactate energy, then you'll get a pretty good result out of it. And if you take about 95% of that, that's a good proxy for your FTP as well. It's a real honest test. You can't fake it. 20 minutes is long enough that if you crack, you crack. And it's a great test to do outside as well. You don't have to do it inside. Go out, find a nice 15K course or so, 14K, 13K usually does it, and just hammer it out. Yes, athletes don't really like them. It can also be dependent on fatigue as well. They're tough to do tired. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, but what kind of athlete you are can influence that result and can throw off that 95% and can throw off your training zones. And a good example of that is if someone's a really punchy rider, if they're good at short, hard, repeated efforts, but maybe they're not great at longer duration efforts, they might have a higher 20-minute than somebody who's a more TTer. So it can throw off, they're using more anaerobic contribution, and that can throw off the whole result. So we'll get to that later. Yeah. All right. So somebody just commented, Joe Pearson just said, yeah, like the ramp test always seemed to be feel off, and it did for me as well. I've done testing on myself with this, and I can tell you that when I do a ramp test, the FTP is higher than it should be. So if you get that, let's say that you get that FTP number, you would then, there's tons of these calculators online, so I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but punch that into a calculator, and this is Joe Friel Power Zones. There's Andy Coggan, there's a ton of different systems, but they generally all go off of your FTP number. And so that's just an example of using 300 watts. And you can see the percentage ranges from there. And then on the right hand side is what those actual power zones look like. So, but there's always a but. Um, and this is the potential pitfall, especially if you use, and I'm not trying to harp on them, even though they've been harping on coaches lately, TrainerRoad or Zwift or any of those programs where you just punch in your FTP number and that's it. And it comes up with a training plan. And then you use erg mode. So erg mode is when you have a smart trainer and all you do is pedal and the trainer controls the power output. So if you're pedaling and it's set to 150 watts, you're going to push 150 watts. The trainer holds you at that. The tricky thing is that below threshold, we have a pretty good idea of those. There's not too much individual variance. Above threshold, so below that red line that I have there, there's a lot of individual variance and it's built off of a bell curve. And if you fall on either side of that bell curve, then those workouts built in, say, a TrainerRoad or a Zwift might be way too hard or way too easy. And I've done consultations with people where they fail workouts constantly, 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 and it's not them. It's not that they're doing them wrong. It's that the workouts aren't built for them. They're off that bell curve, and that's sometimes why maybe they're just too tired and shouldn't be doing that workout. But normally it's because the workout's just not designed for them. So we can actually take it to the next level. And the next few slides are really, I really just want people to be aware of this. You don't have to go to this next level of testing or individualization. I just want people who are new to power to be aware of that. If you're on a Zwift program or TrainerRoad program and the workouts aren't going well, especially the high intensity workouts, you're not hitting those targets, it's okay. Don't feel bad. Adjust your power. Like there's usually ways you can adjust it in there. Um, but there is another way, and that's the model driven. This is kind of next level. So on the right hand side in that graph is the power duration curve, and that's the red line. It's the red smoothed out line that fits in between the MMP. So that's kind of a line of best fit over your mean max curve, which is the yellow. So you can see the yellow line has some dips in it. That's measuring at each one of those points along the curve, and it starts at 1 second, goes up to 5 hours at the end. You might not be able to see that, it's logarithmic. So that's taking power measurements at each spot. So it's not just 5 seconds, it's not just 60 seconds, it's the whole curve. And the goal is you want your yellow MMP curve to be as close to that red as possible, and you have a very accurate model of your unique physiology. And from that, you can get really accurate zones and power targets, especially above threshold. And and it's a great way to go beyond FTP, and you can start to go into why two people with the same FTP can be very different cyclists, even if they're the same weight, even if they have the same power to weight at FTP, they can be two very different performers on the bike. And the great thing about this kind of test data is you can just use informal testing. You don't have to do 20 minutes. If you go out for a 20-minute test and you fail at 18 minutes, that's okay. We get good data out of it. you just have to be in some ballpark. So usually there's a short test, 5 seconds, 60 seconds. I kind of wrote them at the top. And then depending on your physiology, a 20 to 40 minute good long effort. And those will all influence your model threshold. And this is a very accurate way of doing this. And out comes Andy Coggin's I levels, or individualized levels. And this is a great example of this, is two athletes who have very similar FTPs. And so you can see above the red line, above FTP and above, the zones are very, very close. And because they're using the same percentages. And those there can be individual variance there, depending on a few different things, but we know where those athletes lie. Now, if you go below that into, you see FRC, FTP, FRC, PMAX, FRC. Those are new, more specific zones. You can see they start to vary widely. And if you look at the FRC, so it's the third from the bottom, you can see the rider on the left, the athlete on the left, their zone is 513 to 770. So that's like, think of that as an anaerobic zone. Rider on the right, 490 to 604. That's actually, so a narrower zone doesn't go up as high. So you can start to use this to design specific intervals for the person. Okay, all that said and done, if you're just new to power, you don't have to worry about doing all this stuff. Really, there's great ways to do intervals just by time and duration. But this is why athletes or people get frustrated, and I see it on the Zwift Facebook group all the time, is I can't finish this workout, or this is why. Two athletes, same threshold, but a different physiology. Okay, and so moving on to benchmarks. And so training zones, we want to use those in our training, designing workouts. But benchmarks, I think of just things to check in on every once in a while. And go beyond 20 minutes. And I like to kind of use a really short, so 5 to 10 seconds, around 60 seconds. 3 to 5 minutes is a good proxy for max aerobic power, and you can track that over time. And again, you can do this on a cocktail napkin. You don't need a computer program to do it. And so you see this one athlete from last year this time to this year this time. You can see a good improvement across all of those, and that's great. That's what you want to see. Yes, so we could get into power to weight as well. So same athlete, this is taking into account that they actually did put on some mass. And, oh, a little typo there. Sorry about that. But they still improve. So this is just a different way of looking at that same data. The light blue is the recent 90-day data, and the darker shading is last year's data. But you can still see that they did improve, even though they did put on some mass just from growing. This was a younger athlete. And so a great way to kind of do apples to apples. So I just had a question coming in. I'm going to take a quick drink. Great question, Joe, about determining your own physiology. I would say both. It's a great, 75% individualizing your own training to you, and also figuring out what kind of athlete you are. So are you a sprinter or a time trialist is a great polarized example of this. And what do you want to be? So a great example is like I coached two people, and one athlete's a natural punchy rider. So they're a really good pursuiter. They have a big FRC. And that person wants to focus a little bit more, not always, but on longer races. And so the goal there is to try to change their physiology. And that's what training is. We're trying to change your physiology. So it's not necessarily a weakness, but we're trying to tweak their PD curve, their power duration curve, to be a little bit more long and heavy. Whereas somebody else, they're kind of a natural, longer, marathon-y type time trialist, but their focus is shorter races. So we're trying to use this to change that physiology and to really hone in on it. So a little bit of both. Okay, so apples to apples, power to weight, improvement, great. Here's another benchmark that popped in my head after last Monday's is just going out and doing an aerobic power field test where you go ride a 60 to 90 minute loop, preferably fairly flat to rolling, and you ride it at a fixed heart rate. So, and pick something that's pretty steady but not all out. You don't want it to be too easy, but you want it to be something that you're comfortable doing for more than 90 minutes. This isn't a time trial. So generally from a lot of people like 130, 140, 150 beats a minute, something in there. And as your aerobic fitness increases, your speed and your power should increase as well over time, over several months. So if you do this every quarter, let's say, you should just get faster for the same heart rate, and the number should trend in the right direction. I'll show you a good graph that kind of makes this simple. But keep it as consistent as possible so that the variables like wind, how you're dressed, the bike, things like that, kind of try to keep them as even as possible to get good data, and you should see a trend increase. If you have Zwift, do it on Zwift because that's great because there's no wind. I would actually do it on a time trial bike so there's no drafting, and just ride a loop. Pick one of the loops that would take you 60 minutes. Just ride at a fixed heart rate, and another great benchmark that we can use. And I know it's kind of how we would use heart rate, but we can still track the power over time, and hopefully that power starts to increase as well. Okay, and if you're just joining us, feel free to dive in with some questions. Had a few good ones already, and we'll carry on. So I did all these slides last week, last Monday. So I'm gonna go through them really quickly and then get into some examples. So training with power, a few metrics that we want to watch. So this is out of Training Peaks. So I just screen grabbed my Training Peaks, but Strava has these, the Strava Premium has these, Garmin Connect. A lot of different systems have the same data available to you. It might just look a little bit differently. So this first one is kilojoules. So that's really kind of almost how many calories you did, but very accurate because it's actually measuring your energy output. So it's a highly accurate way of just looking at your overall workload that you've done, not just a calculation based on your heart rate and some algorithm. And it is handy for nutrition planning because you can start to look at, oh, that was a 4,000 kilojoule ride, and they're very, very similar to calories versus heart rate might be off a little bit. And it's a great way I like it it's one factor in comparing rides to rides. And if, say, you go from a group ride, it might take you 3 hours to do the same amount of work as it does to do 2 hours on yourself by yourself, or 2.5 by yourself. You can start to kind of look at like, okay, how much work am I doing over time? So moving on, normalized power. So this is one that gets confused a bit. It doesn't just take out zeros. It exponentially weights the 30-second rolling average. And it's more of a stress indicator of how stressful the ride was. But we want to be cautious of this. And a lot of people always just quote their normalized power and they ignore their average power. And that can be a bit of a mistake, in my opinion. TSS, so this is a Training Peaks developed score. I should probably put a little trademark copyright thing on there. And training stress score, so it combines the intensity of a workout and how long the workout was to come up with an overall, difficulty over time. And 1 hour of FTP, 1 hour at your threshold, is equivalent to 100 TSS. So if you go out and do a 200 TSS ride, now that could take several hours, it's the equivalent stress. It's not the same stress though. It's not the the physiology that you're working on is going to be different if you're time trialing or doing endurance, but it's just a way to normalize, workload. But it's not all created equal, and that's a whole other webinar. Like some of those metrics, CTL, ATL, training load that you may have seen. IF, intensity factor. It's your normalized power divided by your set functional threshold power. And really, it is what it is. It's how hard the ride was if you take duration out of it. And it really is actually kind of a proxy for just what training zone this ride was. So generally, you could say, oh, that was a tempo ride because it's 0.8. If it was below, if it was 6, I'd say it's an endurance ride, 0.65. So it's a quick little snapshot of, okay, that was probably around this zone. VI, love this one. Variability index. It's your normalized power divided by your average power, and it's how steady a ride was or a workout was. And or if you look at race data, if you're looking at Zwift races or crits, you can see how punchy a race was. So how off on a race was, it's going to have a higher value. But outside going for a good endurance ride, I like to target 1.0 to 1.0. So it just means that you're not coasting a lot and you're also not spiking the power on climbs. Efficiency is watts per heartbeat, how miles per gallon, how much power you're putting out for each heartbeat. And over time, this is the same as doing that aerobic power benchmark. Over time, you want to see EF trending up. And there's a neat little chart for that, but you don't want to look at this day to day. And a good example is a couple days ago, I did a 2-hour ride, and then my EF was lower. It was 1.3, let's say. And then the next day I did a 2-hour ride, and my EF was 1.4, let's say. But I wasn't really, I can tell you right now, I wasn't fitter. I was tired. I was a little bit fatigued, so my heart rate was lower. It was hot the day before, and I was sweating. The next day it was cold, and I was almost a little bit chilled. So you don't want to look at EF day to day. You want to look at it over time. Cardiac drift or aerobic decoupling is another good one to signal a change in the ride. And if the power to heart rate number goes up to about 10%, it means that your heart rate went up more than your power went up, or your power went down towards the end of a ride versus your heart rate kind of stayed the same. And that signals a change in stress. So it can be fatigue, dehydration, heat. So heat's a big one. If you start doing endurance rides inside, and you don't have really good cooling, you can see this factor go up. And it's only useful in steady state workouts. So you wouldn't really look at power to heart rate or EF on interval workouts or races or that kind of thing. It's something that you want to look at for like endurance rides, tempo rides, that kind of stuff. My VI is always to the left. All right. And so this is that chart I was talking about. It's a representation of what you want to see with good endurance training, especially at this time of year in base season. The whole point of base training and lots of endurance, lots of zone 2 is to have your aerobic efficiency increasing. And so this is a WKO chart, but really it's kind of saying the same thing. It's just you're pushing more power for the same amount of stress. And that's really what we want. Okay, so now into the examples. All right, we're making good time. So if you just joined us or if you're on here, feel free to ask questions. And if I skipped over anything really fast, I can touch on it again. But I wanted to get into some more examples. So this is how, looking at an endurance session, and I have another one in the next slide, I would say that this was a pretty good endurance ride. There's a big break in the middle. I would kind of maybe ask you to ignore that where I had coffee. But other than that, the ride out, the ride back, this was the other day. You can see that I highlighted the range on the left, that's power. So my power was always about above 150, and it never really spiked above 200. And I put a little bit of smoothing on there, but hopefully not too much. but generally a pretty good endurance ride. And heart rate's very steady as well, 120, 140. So I can see that on the left on the graph, on the squiggly lines. The power's the purple, heart rate's the red. But if I just scroll over to the right-hand side and look at those metrics, I can look into those to see, was it steady? Okay, VI 1.04. All right, that's good. I want below 1.1. IF 0.63. Good. I know that my endurance range is 0.6 to 0.7. So I just get a good snapshot. I don't even really have to look at the graph, just look at those metrics. So I know that my normalized power wasn't a whole lot higher than my average power. Power to heart rate actually on here says it dropped, but I can tell you that's because there was a change. And it actually increased if I made each one of these a separate lap. But I sat down for a coffee, I got a little chill, the wind was different, and I actually, my heart rate was a little bit lower going back. So that kind of threw off the metric. So you can always slide these over and do that as well. Uh, Adam is busting me on stopping an endurance ride. Thank you, Adam. 100%. If you the whole idea of endurance rides, and I give myself like a C on this endurance ride, but it was more just looking at the metrics and how steady it was. The whole point of an endurance ride is as steady as possible and looking for those physiological adaptations from just low intensity, but you don't stop. You keep the legs moving consistently, and that's really going to target your muscular endurance, capillarization, mitochondrial density. So by stopping there for half an hour, yeah, like I basically went backwards, and I probably didn't get the same effect as if I didn't stop. I should have ridden past the coffee shop and not stopped at the coffee shop. So, but if we were to put those together, if I didn't stop, pretty good endurance, pretty good steady endurance ride. So I was asked for one that went off the rails, and I think if an endurance ride goes off the rails, it's probably more like going out for a group ride that turns into a race. That's probably going off the rails. But here's one that might not be the best, and it's maybe not horrible, but we could do better. And here's an example of this was actually a group ride that I did, and you can see that the TSS the stress is almost the same, but look at that VI almost 1.4, which means probably a lot of coasting and then kind of surging on climbs, and it wasn't as steady. So it was probably at the front for a bit, probably fell back for a bit, freewheeling in the group. And again, we just want to talk about quality, right? So if the trainer in me would say that this wasn't a good training ride. The coach in me might say this is important to go out and ride with other people, so we just kind of do these sometimes. But it's again, we can just look at these metrics and just look at the quality of the ride. IF was about the same, but you can see that a lot of TSS came from a high normalized power, not necessarily a steady average power. If an endurance ride, one of the best endurance sessions that you can do, I didn't want to cherry pick, but jump on your trainer or rollers, even better, and just whatever your endurance wattage is, jump on there, ride it for an hour, steady, no pedaling. Some of those indoor sessions that we do, they're some of the best training you will ever do for endurance riding. And I know it can be mind numbing, but if you put on some Netflix, if you ride some Zwift, and just keep that power nice and steady, it's going to do dividends. And you can actually train less. You can squeeze more kilojoules and more TSS and into less time on the trainer as well, especially if we're not going through stop signs and stoplights and all those things. Okay, so that's one that just, yeah, okay, it was a 2 hour ride, but maybe could be better. But there was no coffee shop stop, so maybe it balances out. So here's a great example, and this kind of goes back to the calibrating um, note that I made earlier in the webinar, is without power, sometimes we can overshoot a little bit when we're feeling good and feeling fresh, and maybe someone who's new to power or new to training. So this was a 4x10 sub threshold sweet spot workout. So um, the red line is heart rate, and I overlaid my heart rate zone so those were a little bit more visible. And as you can see, that first one, you can see a warm up phase there where my heart rate is a little bit slower to react. Um, and so so I see your question, Jamie. Virtual power, it's a tough one. I've never used, so the question is virtual power on, using Zwift or not a smart trainer? I'd say if it's consistent, then yes, it has some meaning. But you have to really work hard at making sure it's consistent. So you want to make sure that your tire is pumped up to the same pressure every time, and your have the same press on force, so the same tension on the trainer. If you can keep all those things as consistent as possible, then it has some meaning. But it's I can tell you that it's never as accurate. Power meters are all within a few percent of the good ones, um, and the calculated power it's lacking. It's usually not quite that accurate, but it's still a good gauge, and you can still use some of these metrics and take a look at them. So um, yeah, back to sweet spot. This was one where I was kind of patient. I kind of knew my zone, but if I didn't have power, I might have overshot that first one, and just to get my heart rate in the zone. Whereas really, I just had to be patient and let the heart rate kind of climb up into the workout. So again, and then by the end of it, you can see that, yeah, I was kind of in zone for the last 3 or so workouts, or sorry, 3 or so intervals. So, and then an anaerobic workout, and I put those in quotes, and that's a whole other webinar. But again, you can see on the scale, on the left-hand side, the purple line is the power line, so that's 100 way up to 500. So these were 50-second intervals. And again, this is where power is awesome because it's instantaneous. And if I zoomed in, you would see that there's a delay in heart rate. You can see that the heart rate spike comes after the interval is done. So the heart rate's the red line. And I should have maybe zoomed in on one of these to illustrate that. So again, it's that consistent. And when you're doing a 30 seconds interval or a 50-second interval or something that's short, you're never going to actually do it by heart rate because your heart rate always takes longer to react. All you can do is look at it after and be like, oh wow, that was heart rate got high there. But what I really like, this is a great use of power, and training with power was using very targeted intervals. So that was using eye levels to target those ranges where it wasn't just, okay, go as hard as you can for 50 seconds. Here's the range. And that can be tricky at that high intensity, just to accumulate a lot of time in that zone. And you can see there that the performance didn't really decrease throughout those intervals. They didn't get less as I went on towards the end. The power didn't drop, in other words. Kept that performance pretty steady, and that would be tough to do without a power meter, without a smart. This was a trainer workout. And again, yeah, you can see how IF is pretty high, normalized power. VI is very high, so not a great metric to even. We know VI is going to be high in an anaerobic workout like this. So that's a great example of an anaerobic workout. What do I have next? Okay, I just added this one on kind of towards the end. We are getting towards the end, so if you have any questions, shoot them up there because I don't want to quit too early, and there's a bit of a delay. So this is just my go-to data screen that I have on my Garmin, and I just like to keep things simple. And you can see I don't have speed, distance, anything like that. I just have heart rate and lap heart rate, power on a 3-second smoothing. That's really I like that more than just current power, because current power jumps around a little bit too much. So having a 3 second, 5 second, 10 second smoothing field on your Garmin, or on your device, I should say, not just Garmin, really does help just keep it steady, and you're not just chasing a power number and cadence. And then Moxie is another thing that I use, and that's a whole other webinar as well. But that's my go-to training screen. You can see it just, and I have another one if I need to know what time it is, or my overall ride time, or those things. But really, I just keep it simple. Um, and so, kind of coming to the end now. Um, I Another webinar that I want to do is training with a Moxie or muscle oxygen saturation, and because it's a very physiological feedback, whereas power is just the output, and we don't know what's contributing to that power. Really, we're just pushing more or less of it, and there's no real view inside. Heart rate's a great physiological feedback tool as well, but what the Moxie does, or what muscle oxygen saturation does, and that's the green line on this chart, is it shows in real time, it's instantaneous as well, the supply and demand situation in your muscles. So I won't go that deep into it here. I don't want to keep you all night, and that's a whole other, that can be in a whole other, several hours. But I just wanted to throw on that screen. This was a bit of a ramp test protocol, and you can see that muscle oxygen saturation dropping as the intensity is going up. And yes, it kind of parallels, or is an inverse to heart rate, but it also tells us a few different things. So anyways, I will cut myself off there, and I'm going to give myself another minute or two if anybody else has any questions. And then other than that, I'll let you go. Thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning in. If you know somebody who's interested in this stuff, it will be posted afterwards. Um, and yeah, all right. So thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone.